how was infrastructure investment able to not only create but then self-sustain a commodity market?
That's a really brilliant question. Obviously, in order for oil to be extracted, you need some very basic things, and some of these very basic things are, for example, a port, which allows you to bring in pipes, equipment, the kinds of material you need in order to dig a well, but also, very importantly, you need to bring in the material to, for example, build an entire infrastructure for workers to live in. So there was a way in which this kind of a construction of an infrastructure, investment in infrastructure, allowed for extractive industries, for commodity production to proceed. In addition to that, you actually need also other kinds of virtual infrastructures. You need legal property regimes. You need to have modes of defining who has access, for example, to which part of underground or above ground resources. When you're talking about maritime shorelines, what defines what offshore and onshore is? So you need a legal infrastructure in order to be able to do this kind of extraction and commodity production as well. And I think it's the combination of, on the one hand, building a material physical infrastructure that allows us, facilitates this across the years, but also to having a legal and procedural and accounting and expertise infrastructure that allows for commodity production to become self-sustaining in some senses. In addition to that, there's a very interesting way in which Aramco, or the oil company, had ways of expanding its market through infrastructure production. For example, a very interesting story is that when they built roads in Saudi Arabia, that meant that they had to actually produce asphalt in order for the roads to be built. That meant that their production of asphalt required further ramping up of the production of commodities, but also it meant that more cars were going to be driving, so which were going to be needing more petrol, more gasoline, and therefore that also essentially expanded their market. So there is a way in which this essentially became a kind of a virtuous financial cycle for them, where the more they invested in infrastructure, the more they expanded their market and commodity production domain.
Through the creation of transportation systems by oil extraction companies, how is the military able to take advantage of commercial assets?
There's several aspects to this. The US, in its own continental territories, actually has a very carefully maintained list of what it considers to be strategic transport assets. And that includes not only port infrastructures, but also transportation companies and whatnot, which it can call on should there ever be a need for mobilizing such transport infrastructures. But overseas, there are also ways in which the US has, for example, had, and it's not just limited to the US, most world powers have these kinds of arrangements, where they have deals with various kinds of ports, for example, for berthing of their ships and the repair of their ships and their shipyards, for the use of transport infrastructures in the case of ramping up or drawdowns from a theater of war, and various other instances. But the US, again, is a very special case, as were the British, in the sense that they also have very intimate relationships with the oil companies. And so there are extensive archival records of the oil companies and the US military exchanging skills, equipment, crafts, work and intelligence and knowledge about various aspects of infrastructure construction. So in a sense, not only military logistics, but actually the day-to-day work of the militaries was very dependent on these oil companies in particular.
In looking at the workers of Aramco, how has the intersection between trade and security and the hierarchy introduced influenced the development of labor relations?
One of the most amazing books about Aramco's labor relations is Bob Vitalis's America's Kingdom, in which he writes extensively about the way that Aramco, which was essentially at the start an American oil company, brought with it to Saudi Arabia particular Jim Crow arrangements, essential racist arrangements for housing and various other things. But one of the other ways in which labor relations were transformed by the security and trade, war and commerce was the 1948 emergence of the State of Israel and the expulsion of Palestinians, many of whom first went to the countries of the Levant, of the Mashriq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and also Egypt. And then from there, many of whom who were skilled, some of whom spoke English, some of whom had past experience of working in these kinds of sophisticated jobs and infrastructure, ended up making their way to the Gulf. And so there is a particularly interesting account of the way the sudden explosion in the number of Palestinian workers for Aramco, for example, or for the Kuwaiti oil companies, resulted in Palestinians, essentially their blood, sweat and tears being expended on the making of not only the oil companies, but also the transport infrastructures that transported their workers, their equipment and their products.